Thursday's hearing. It's Democrat Elaine Luria of Virginia. Congresswoman, welcome back to Meet the Press. So the dam has begun to break. Obviously, that means more evidence, more witnesses. But let me ask about a specific witness that we've not heard from. That is probably the biggest one besides the president, and that'd be Mark Meadows. Are we going to hear from him, or is the extent of his cooperation all that we got?
I have no indication right now that he is, changed his position or willing to come forward in any way that he wasn't before. As you recall, he gave us a trove of text messages, which have, led us to a lot of other information relative to the investigation. But ever since we subpoenaed him, he defied that subpoena. Justice Department essentially threw that case out. There's not, to my knowledge, been any change of mind on his behalf.
It's interesting. You talked about that you guys made a criminal referral to the Justice Department, and they threw it out. But they just got a conviction on Bannon. Mm-hmm. Do you want them to revisit the Meadows decision?
Well, I don't know the process by which, I don't think that they can revisit something that they've already dismissed. But he's certainly someone who has probably more information than anyone, other than the folks we've already heard from who were in the White House that day. So that information will be incredibly helpful. But we've been able to piece together so much, as you've seen. Cassidy Hutchinson, Sarah Matthews, other people who were present in the White House. And so if he's listening, we'd love to hear from him.
This has been a very orderly way that you've sort of showcased the evidence as you've gotten it. And it feels somewhat conclusionary, and yet now you say they're going to be hearings in September. What part of the timeline should we expect? Is this more about January 6th and after? Is that what we should expect in September, more about his actions on January 7th, 8th, and 9th?
Well, so you said Liz Cheney mentioned the dam is broken. Sort of the floodgates have opened. I mean, I think when we initially planned the arc of the story, the information, the way we would present that through these hearings, we thought that the hearing this week would be the final hearing. But so many more witnesses has come forward. We've got new information that we're requesting and receiving as well from the Secret Service, and there's just a lot of questions still to be answered on that front. So I think that's something we're still working through, taking in this new information, putting it on top of, laying it on top of what we've already presented. So I think there'll be some information that covers the whole span, but probably more in depth and more conclusive about maybe some things we didn't know as much about. I mean, there's still so much out there that we don't fully understand yet.
In my library at home, I have paperbacks of the Warren Commission, the Iran-Contra hearings, of the Watergate hearings, of the Starr Report. Is there going to be a January 6th committee, basically report that the American people, tangible, that they will have in their hands, and if so, when?
That will be the final product of the committee. I think that the timeline for putting that report out, it's still to be determined as we continue to do the investigation.
It has to be before January 3rd, 2000, right? It has to be before January 3rd of next year, given this Congress ends.
Yes, but many folks have said, would that be before the election, after? I mean, we're not looking at it through a political lens of the midterm elections. We're looking at it through getting to the truth about the events of January 6th. And we're actively continuing the investigation and on a parallel path, working on putting together the information for the report and our recommendations. I mean, that's the most important part of this, because as a congressional committee, we're tasked with providing recommendations to prevent something like this in the future.
I want to ask about the decision to grant anonymity, because, at the end of the hearing on Thursday, Vice Chair Liz Cheney praised the courage of the witnesses that have risked so much to publicly come forward. I mean, we saw in real time what Sarah Matthews went through, just, with former colleagues attacking her on social media in real time. So on one hand, you've got these brave folks coming out and putting their name and face and reputations on the line. And then you granted anonymity over here. I bet you there's a lot of witnesses that wish they could have gotten that anonymity. Explain why you granted it.
Well, we did that in the case of some national security professionals. And I think it's very important, both for their continuation of the roles in which they serve. And also, this is one of those things that's really the most disturbing about this. I served in uniform for 20 years, and understanding that there's a lot of people who are professionals who have information, but they've seen what happened in the Trump White House for people who came forward and how they had retribution, retaliation. I think those people fear that if Donald Trump ever came near the White House again, they'd have a target on their back.
I understand that, but, anonymous sources, look, in my business, anonymous sources are certainly helpful and useful, but to the public, it gives them skepticism. And using an anonymous source, it does lessen the credibility of that information in the eyes of some people.
Well, I would say I totally disagree. I think we have to respect the privacy, and in this case anonymity, and safety of these people, both from a physical safety standpoint, but also for them to be able to continue their roles in government unimpeded. So it was a decision that we made in the committee really easily because we understood the importance of maintaining their anonymity. But the takeaway from it is the fact is that if the Trump administration were to come back again, these people, they fear retaliation.
Right. The Justice Department, are you seeing any signs? I know you've been among those frustrated about what appears to be a lack of a criminal investigation. Do you see any signs that one's been opened?
I sure as hell hope they have a criminal investigation at this point into Donald Trump. I have no direct knowledge of the status of their investigations, but what I'd say is, I can tell the Department of Justice is watching our hearings closely. There have been cases for criminal defendants who've been charged and found guilty for events on January 6th, and they have actually quoted testimony from the January 6th witnesses and hearings. So, Merrick Garland has already told us he's listening, and if he's watching today, I tell him he doesn't need to wait on us because I think he has plenty to keep moving forward.
How do you guys, the Georgia investigation, which is happening simultaneously, has there been any overlap there at all, or is that something that essentially you guys are observers of?
I'd say the latter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Liz Cheney gave a pretty impassioned speech and praised how many women have had the guts to come out versus the men that have hid behind executive privilege.
It was very clever.
It was an interesting take. And I know you've grown professionally pretty close to her. Look, her primary in Wyoming may go a way that she doesn't want it to go. But would you like to see her run for president in 2024? I
admire Liz Cheney. I've been friendly with her ever since I came to Congress, even before we served on this committee together. And I think, if she doesn't, come through this primary and come back to Congress, there are so many things that she can do in the future for our country.
I'm not asking whether you would support her running for president, but as somebody, do you think her voice is needed?
Her voice is absolutely needed, and I think she's one of, unfortunately, a very small number of people who need to be the face of the Republican Party in the future. I would love to get back to where we had two political parties that, debate on issues and facts and not, lies. And I, really hope that Liz Cheney will continue. And, I don't want to speculate. She's said herself she doesn't know what her future plans would be.
We shall see, but there's definitely the need for a leader of a pro-democracy wing of the GOP. Elaine Luria, Congresswoman, Democrat from Virginia. Thanks very much. All right, we're going to continue our conversation here about January 6th and what the investigation may do to Donald Trump, both politically and legally here. Panel is here. Yamiche Alcindor, who, of course, works here at NBC News and is the host of Washington Week on PBS. Jake Sherman, the co-founder of Punchbowl News. Stephen Hayes, editor of The Dispatch, and Maria Teresa Kumar, president of Voto Latino. I want to start, I ended with Liz Cheney there, and I want to start with her, but I want to start with her diagnosis of how Donald Trump weaponized parts of the Republican Party. Take a listen.
Donald Trump knows that millions of Americans who supported him would stand up and defend our nation were it threatened. He is preying on their patriotism. He is preying on their sense of justice. And on January 6th, Donald Trump turned their love of country into a weapon against our Capitol and our Constitution.
Steve Hayes, I thought that was when we go to this idea, don't attack Trump supporters, Bret Stephens' column from the New York Times this week, I thought this was a fascinating way for her to try to show how Trump manipulated these people.
Yeah, and I think she's absolutely right. And if you look at what's happened over the course of these hearings, they've provided the details of how she's right. I mean, this is what Donald Trump has done. He's telling people who, there's a huge group of Republicans who don't pay attention to every twist and turn of what's happening in Washington the way that we do. They're living their lives, they're raising their families, they're going to work, and they're not aware of all of the things that Donald Trump has done. I think one of the things the hearings has made clear is that if you thought on January 6th or January 7th that there was this rally and Donald Trump had the right to raise objections and you weren't really paying attention, But that, ultimately, this wasn't really Donald Trump's fault. The hearings have made clear that this was a plan, a multifaceted plan, detailed, laid out in advance with the help of top Trump advisors and crazy people who are not Trump advisors. Just showing that and providing the facts from people who worked for Trump. That, I think, is what's made these hearings so effective, is they came from Republicans, and not just Republicans, but Republicans who chose to dedicate their career to working for Donald Trump. These are the people making the case against Trump.
So, Yamiche, it's sticking as a narrative. Is it going to have an political impact?
I mean, that is the key question. It is the question that I think is sort of unanswered. When I talk to Republicans, both those who are horrified by what former President Trump did, as well as those who are still supportive of him, they all think that the opinions were sort of hardened long before these hearings, that these hearings have brought out new information. But in terms of sort of whether or not you think Donald Trump was wrong to do January 6th, wrong to pour gasoline on the fire at 2:24 when this mob was already in the Capitol and former Vice President Mike Pence is running through the halls and being evacuated. They say that this really isn't going to make a big political difference. Of course, the midterms are a long way away. 2024 is even farther away. And Liz Cheney's words could be a model for the kind of Republican argument for someone who wants to win the nomination if Trump ends up getting in the race. But I will also say that when you think about what former President Trump is doing, even this week, he is continuing to try to get the election overturned, right? He's calling up Wisconsin officials this week, trying to get them to change their results. This is someone who is stuck to this plan, who is believing that this is just sort of the way forward. And he has a large base of people who are still continuing to support him. And I will say one other thing. I watched this video on set with you, watched the hearing on set with you and Lester Holt and so many others. And I'm still sort of baffled by the fact that this happened. It's still surreal that people broke into our Capitol and that Donald Trump hasn't been completely excommunicated, not just from the Republican Party, but from the entire political atmosphere.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting, though, is that what Liz Cheney is referring to now, is that the fever seems to be breaking. The fact that Pence went into Arizona to go ahead and rally for another candidate, that's huge. The fact that his candidates, Trump's candidates, Dr. Oz and J.D. Vance, are not doing well, that they're in a dead heat, also speaks to perhaps their fever breaking. But the fact that on Friday, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post went against Donald Trump and basically said that he was unfit for office, regardless if there is a criminal indictment by the DOJ, that is big business.
Well, the Murdochs have made it clear which side they want to be on.
And this is the other thing, is that what we may be seeing right now is, does Trump go at alone? Is it more close to what Teddy Roosevelt did in 1912 with the Bull Moose Party and said, you know what, I'm going to break off and cleave from the Republican Party and create my own? And that's something to watch.
I think we as journalists and as political observers tend to overstate what people are going to vote for. I think that these hearings have laid a foundation in people's minds that Donald Trump obviously was. I was in the Capitol on January 6th. He was obviously responsible in a major way. And the people who have, Kevin McCarthy and the Republican leadership, who have decided to not be a part of this investigation, I think that is probably the biggest act of political malpractice I have ever seen. And I think all of that will lay a foundation. Maybe it's not this election. Right. Maybe it's an election in the future.
I think that's where I lean, is that it's less 22, probably more 24. But here's one truism, and I got to go, which is candidates that are focused on the past. Welcome back. If there's one overriding explanation for President Biden's sinking approval ratings, well, as James Carville once said, it's the economy, stupid. Wage gains are being gobbled up by inflation, which increased by 9.1% in June over last year, the highest rate in more than 40 years, which is a phrase we've said after every inflationary report over the last 6 months. Just this past week, Mr. Biden's approval rating on the economy in a new Quinnipiac poll was just 28%, with 66% disapproving. Inflation was by far the most significant issue cited. So let's dig into it. Joining me now is the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. Secretary Yellen, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let me just start with this. Many businesses seem to be preparing for a recession. Should all Americans at home be preparing for for a recession that many people think now is likely?
Well, look, the economy is slowing down. Last year, it grew very rapidly at about 5.5%, and that succeeded in putting people back to work who had lost their jobs during the pandemic. the labor market is now extremely strong. Even just during the last 3 months, net job gains averaged 375,000. This is not an economy that's in recession, but we're in a period of transition in which growth is slowing, and that's necessary and appropriate, and we need to be growing at a steady and sustainable pace. So there is a slowdown, and businesses can see that, and that's appropriate given that people now have jobs and we have a strong labor market. But you don't see any of the signs now. A recession is a broad-based contraction that affects many sectors of the economy. We just don't have that. Consumer spending remains solid. It's continuing to grow. Industrial output has grown in 5 of the 6 most recent months. Credit quality remains very strong. Household balance sheets are generally in good shape, but inflation is way too high. And, the Fed is charged with putting in place policies that will bring inflation down. And I expect them to be successful. The administration, for its part, is supplementing those Fed policies with things we can do. We've cut the deficit by a record $1.5 trillion this year. Releases of gas from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve are putting some downward pressure on gas prices. We've seen gas prices just in recent weeks come down by about 50 cents, and there should be more in the pipeline. And hopefully we will pass a bill that will lower prescription drug costs and maintain current levels of healthcare costs.
You seem pretty optimistic, it sounds like, from that answer, that we're going to avoid a recession. But I want to throw in 2 data points that you didn't bring up. One was these reports on Friday about both in the Euro space and in the United States that we've seen some contraction of business activity. Throw in the uptick of unemployment, the weekly unemployment number there. Is that not the first sign of a coming recession, even if it's a mild one?
Well, I would say that we're seeing a slowdown. We're likely to see some slowing of job creation, but I don't think that that's a recession. A recession is broad-based weakness in the economy. We're not seeing that now, and I absolutely don't think that's necessary. But look, there are also risks we have to appreciate. Inflation is high, not just in the United States, but also in many of our neighbors in the UK, in Canada, in the Euro area. Central banks are addressing that. We have a war in Ukraine that threatens potentially even higher oil prices than we're seeing right now. One of the things that I've been doing in recent weeks is working with our allies to try to cap the price of that Russia receives for its oil, both to diminish the revenues that Russia gets, but also to keep Russian oil selling in global markets so that when the next round of sanctions is put in place in December by the European Union, we're concerned that significant amounts of oil could be shut in Russia, leading to an oil price spike. So there are threats on the horizon. Growth is slowing globally, and I'm not saying that we will definitely avoid a recession, but I think there is a path that keeps the labor market strong and brings inflation down.
Help us play armchair economist this week. There is a ton of data coming out this week. It's probably a fun week for an economist because we're going to have consumer confidence survey, the second quarter GDP numbers. We got the inflation numbers for June. Which is the indicator? What's the number you're most focused on that will give you a better indication of where this economy is headed?
Well, I look at all the data, and GDP will be closely watched. A common definition of recession is 2 negative quarters of GDP growth, or at least that's something that's been true in past recessions. When we've seen that, there has usually been a recession. And many economists expect second quarter GDP to be negative. First quarter GDP was negative. So we could see that happen, and that will be closely watched. But I do want to emphasize what a recession really means is a broad-based contraction in the economy. And even if that number is negative, we are not in a recession now. And I would, warn that we should be not characterizing that as a recession.
I understand that, but you're splitting hairs. I mean, if the technical definition is 2 quarters of contraction, you're saying that's not a recession?
That's not the
No?
That's not the technical definition. There's an organization called the National Bureau of Economic Research that looks at a broad range of data in deciding whether or not there is a recession. And most of the data that they look at right now continues to be strong. I would be amazed if the NBER would declare this period to be a recession, even if it happens to have 2 quarters of negative growth. We've got a very strong labor market. When you're creating almost 400,000 jobs a month, that is not a recession.
Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, and obviously the former chair of the Federal Reserve. Always appreciate getting you on and getting your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck.
We are back. Look, I want to show this set of numbers from Quinnipiac because this was a classic pox on all of Washington. Job approval ratings. The Supreme Court is the tallest little person in the room here, sitting at an approval rating of 37%. President Biden is lording over congressional Democrats with 31% job approval to their 30% job approval, with Republicans in Congress 23%. This is the cross current, Maria Teresa, that is, I think, making the midterms like it's not a done deal yet.
The midterms, I can say right now, is absolutely not going to be a blowout. In 2014, we saw the opposing party at least 30 points ahead of the Democrats at the time, and it was clear that they were going to change. Now it is a dead heat. You look at the Senate, it does look like you're going to have perhaps 2 senators, one from Ohio, one from Pennsylvania, on the Democratic side. And among the Democrats inside Washington, it's like, we may lose the House, but let's limit the losses. And while it looks like when you poll Republican against Democrat, it looks like it's almost a dead heat evenly. The moment that you put a MAGA Republican against a Democrat, that all of a sudden stirs a completely different reaction among the population. So I think it's going to be closer than folks realize.
Steve, every other midterm when the out party wins, they fashion themselves as something new.
Right.
That is the missing piece here for the GOP. They're not offering anything new.
No, they're hoping to trade on volatility and the unpopularity of Joe Biden. If you go back, though, and look at races since 2006, every single election since 2006, with the exception of 2012, when Barack Obama was reelected, has been a change election. That is extraordinary volatility in our politics, and I think we're likely to see more of it now. Republicans, I think, could well succeed. I do expect that it will be a pretty good day for Republicans, certainly in the House, maybe in the Senate, because they're not Joe Biden, because people are looking at these inflation numbers, because we could be on the verge of a recession. Their view is we don't have to put forth much of an agenda, and to the extent that we do, it'll be negative for us.
By the way, speaking of recession, boy, Janet Yellen seemed to preview that GDP might be negative this week, and a lot of people are going to say that's going to meet a definition of recession. Hey, but don't call it a recession. What do you make of that spin, Yamiche?
It's really interesting because obviously the Treasury Secretary and the White House, they don't want to be leaning in too much into negative language when it comes to the economy, especially because we're in this strange place in the economy where there's all these jobs, but still Americans are seeing low wages. They want to get raises, but also people are just sort of tired of doing the sort of economy that we had pre-pandemic. People want to have more flexibility. People are leaving their jobs. And then when I also looked at these numbers and we think about sort of the approval rating in Washington, Washington. I also went back and looked at the approval rating of scientists, of journalists. Americans are sort of in a position where they don't like anyone right now, and that probably benefits the Republicans. But there's also, of course, still abortion politics and sort of the way that Democrats want to mobilize on that issue. But I think overall, America's in a weird place because I think we're still traumatized by the pandemic. We're still dealing with all of the things, all the challenges that are coming up. And then I think you also have Americans just sort of trying to balance their, I think, real apathy for all of the different sectors of government and science and the media.
Part of me wants to just say, and this is based on conversations I've had on the Hill the last couple of weeks, is don't overthink it. I mean, Republicans have the largest majority in the House of Representatives that they've had, in a very long time. It doesn't take a lot for them to have a historically large Republican majority. Will that happen? I have no idea, but it doesn't, if they win the mean, the average of what they would win in a midterm election, in the first midterm election of a president's cycle, they're already in one of the largest majorities in a very long time. So I think that is what, and add on negative GDP numbers, add on a stagnant economy, and I think we're going to have a really good night for Republicans on Capitol Hill.
The issue with the Senate races, though, is something that seems to be, I mean, it is the story of 2010 for the Republicans. It was the story of why it took them an extra 4 years to get the Senate the last time.
It's really interesting to watch because you've had a bunch of Republican candidates, Herschel Walker in Georgia, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, J.D. Vance in Ohio, who have, let's put it mildly, struggled a little bit, or ranging from a little bit to a lot. And Mitch McConnell's super PAC, the Senate Leadership Fund, has not really gotten in and pushed their preferred candidates in a lot of races this cycle. They had threatened to. They threatened to, and they still might in Missouri if Eric Greitens nears that nomination. But it is very interesting to see them kind of take this hands-off approach while Raphael Warnock is, kind of eyes on the prize and charging ahead against Herschel Walker, who a video came out last week where he was imagining to be an FBI agent, and he said he was an FBI agent. Republicans are kind of just sitting there on Capitol Hill being like, God, what is going on?